Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Mark Steyn, whose writing on war, politics, the arts, and culture can be read around the world, from the Atlantic Monthly to the Australian. He's the author of America Alone, The End of the World as We Know It. He is visiting the Berkeley campus as the 2007 Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz Lecturer at Berkeley. Joining us in the studio is Professor Emeritus Thomas Barnes of History and Law. Welcome, gentlemen. Mark, welcome to Berkeley.
Glad to be here.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Toronto, and I had, I guess, the bulk of my schooling over in the United Kingdom at King Edward's School, which I was just talking with Professor Barnes, is the alma mater of J.R.R. Tolkien, among others. So however well my book does, it's never going to be the top bestseller to be produced by anyone from that school. So I'm basically, I regard myself as a child of the tail end of the British Empire, as it were.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Well, that's interesting. My father's Irish and my mother's Belgian, and they both wound up in Canada in completely different ways. My father was doing what a lot of young men did at that time. He was just kind of loafing around the colonies for a couple of years. My mother was there in more dramatic circumstances. Like, her family had decided to abandon her native country of Belgium, and they just happened to pick Canada because their town had been liberated by Canadian troops at the end of the Second World War, and that's why they chose Canada. A lot of people did that. A lot of Dutch people did as well. And so in a sense their reasons for being in Canada were completely different. One was there just out of that kind of sense of entitlement that the English-speaking peoples have, that they can kind of go all over the world and live where they want and do as they please, and whereas my mother was just sort of swept there by the tides of history. And I do think, in a sense, that kind of difference resonates with me to this day, really.
Was there a lot of talk around the dinner table about politics, art, and culture? Because you cover so many topics in your writing, and your writing is so globalized in a way.
Well, I don't think my mother is a completely apolitical person. You know, if she has any kind of credo, it's you know, the Beatles, all you need is love, and I just roll my eyes and move on to. And this is a woman, you know, who basically grew up under Nazi occupation and must understand at some basic level that this is not going to take you far in exceptional circumstances. My father, I think, was a great influence on me, at least in terms of my cultural writing, because he certainly had a very broad range of musical and cultural interests in that way.
Mm-hmm. And what did you have any teachers or mentors who pushed you in the direction of wanting to be a writer? Yeah.
I did have school teachers that did have an impact on me. They were good teachers. I was not a good student, really, right from, I would say, what would now be, I don't know, grade 6 or 7, the equivalent. I got bored easily, and if I felt I'd kind of mastered the general thrust of things, I had a tendency, my mind had a tendency to wander off. I wasn't a particularly good student. I was brilliantly adept at inventing ever more implausible excuses as to why certain homework hadn't been turned in on time, and I think what I did like about the teachers I had was that they put up with a lot of that, and they still gave you credit for when you did things right. Mm-hmm. And I'm sometimes pleasantly surprised when you happen to be going through the attic or whatever, and you find something you wrote at 14, and you thought, my goodness, this actually stands up pretty well. It's the voice in embryo. I happened to read an essay that Kingsley Amis, the British novelist, wrote at school when he was 11, And it is like, it is actually the first draft of a Kingsley Amis novel. If there was like a kind of junior Amis, that's what it would be like. All the kind of muscle and vigor of the prose is there present in embryo, and I think that's always good when you can see
You
that.
told a tale yesterday to Brandon Little's 101 section about having gone to the attic and found a book that you found very, very useful when it came in precisely to doing the work for. You might recount that, because I think that's revelatory of two things. I think it's revelatory, first of all, of the nature of the education you got, and I think it's also revelatory, gives a lie to your assertion that you were just more or less a goof off.
Well, after September 11th, I found myself not, everybody suddenly had to become an expert on Islam. You know, we all suddenly got out the maps of Afghanistan and were pointing out what was going to go right and what was going to go wrong. And I didn't actually find a lot of the commentary in the newspapers useful, not just the pundits, but every time they'd call on some professor of Middle Eastern studies to write something. And particularly when it came to Wahhabism, which is the form of Islam that the Saudis have done such a grand job of exporting all over the world. And it rang a very dim and distant bell with me that I'd come across it before. And I remembered what it was, which was that at high school, at some point doing a particular obscure corner of Indian history, we'd learned about the attempted Wahhabi subversion of British India. They did very well at one point. One guy fatally stabbed the Chief Justice of India, and the following year another Wahhabi fatally stabbed the Viceroy. And as I said to Professor Barnes, these were yesterday in the class, these were in fact the highest profile successes of the Wahhabist movement until September 11th. And I kind of had vague memory of that, and I went upstairs to the attic where I had my old school books, and I went through the relevant history books, and I found the one, and I looked up a little bit more on it, and it actually is that incident is in America alone, so a kind of old-fashioned history education can come in useful.
So I think you're saying that this kind of global education that you got as a result of who your parents were and being an emerging citizen of an empire, you know, in the last stages, suggests that that's really how you found your voice as a writer. Talk a little about that.
Well, I think first of all, if you're not from America, it's easy to write in different markets. If you notice, I go around this country, and if you go, say, to the New York Post, it's full of Australians. You'll go to other media outposts in America, and they're full of British people. There's a lot of British, Canadian, Australian people doing very well in the American media. And there's not really a lot of equivalence to that if you go to, there's not really a lot of Americans working in Britain or Australia and Canada. For one reason, this is the #1 country in the world, so if you want to make it and you're an American, you're already kind of in the top market. Why would you want to go to Canada or Australia or Britain? And so I do think one of the advantages, though, of being from those kind of other countries is that it is easier to move around, to write for different markets, for different audiences. And in a sense, which I think is a particular Canadian skill, is Canadians grow up as the world's greatest observer culture. The 49th parallel, from a Canadian point of view, is the world's biggest store window, and you're on the outside looking in. I think that's one reason why Canadians are particularly good at moving down here and becoming funny guys, whether it's you know, Jim Carrey or Leslie Nielsen, or at the more elevated humorist end, as it were, because they watch American pop culture as outsiders, and that can be very useful because you're both an expert in it, but you're also at one remove from it, which gives you a perspective on it, which, as I said, I think is particularly useful for comedy. And I think that's, but I think everyone in certain parts of the English-speaking world, at least, I think everyone thinks they know America. And in fact, I think it's more complicated. It's not more complicated than that. The longer I live here, the more I'm aware that there's things that are profoundly different from countries that a few years ago I thought were much more similar.
Mm-hmm. If students and the general public watch this, I always like to ask writers like yourself what you think are the skills and the temperament required for being a professional writer.
Well, I think the first thing is you just have to do it. I think if you sit around waiting for the great opening sentence, you'll never write anything. You mentioned my father. My father was an art expert, and he always, for years, he was planning to write a book on art, and he used to leave notes for himself by the telephone, and it would be, you know, the note would be, go to post office, pay gardener, write book. And it's like, and of course, if you just leave notes by the telephone for you like that, you never will write the book. And so I think a lot of it is just doing it. And I'm often, when I started in journalism, and you're like a kind of cocky young punk, and you can't quite understand why it is that some of these guys you think are just like middle-aged bores who haven't written anything interesting in 25 years are holding down all the jobs. And my limited experience of being in the editing rooms at newspapers is that often it's because they're the guys who are reliable, that if you say we need this by 5 p.m., they deliver it by 5 p.m. You know, we have that awful phrase, oh, he's just phoning it in. You'd be surprised if you're at the editor, from the editor's point of view, how grateful you are for the guy who phones it in compared to when it's 5 o'clock and you haven't got the copy and you're waiting there and all that. So I think at a certain level you just got to be reliable. You just got to get on and do it. And I think after that, if you really don't want to be spending a couple of hours a day writing, you really should not be writing. You shouldn't be doing it. Mm-hmm. I'm a painfully slow writer compared to a lot of people. I'm always horrified when I hear people saying how long they take to write a book, or you know, because it comes very slowly to me. But I think even if it comes slowly, you've just got to actually sit down there and do it.
You are doing writing in a globalized world with multimedia platforms. How does that complicate your vocation?
Well, I don't believe you can write for the world, and I think when you try to, you produce something very boring. One example of that, it was something I was just looking at, in fact, in preparation for the Nimitz lectures, is General Musharraf's biography, autobiography, his memoir, In the Line of Fire. Yeah. Now, when you listen to General Musharraf talk, he has a very engaging and particular way of talking. He speaks that kind of clipped Raj English that a lot of the Pakistani military do, and it has a particular rhythm and beauty of its own. And I love it when he's talking there about these. When you listen to him talk about these Qaeda chaps in the Pakistani tribal lands. Now his book, he did some, I think it was Simon and Schuster in New York. His book has been either ghost-written or rewritten by his editor into a kind of bland, colorless, standard American English. And as a result, it's not written in, it's a great book in many ways, but it's not written in General Musharraf's voice. And I think that's the danger, that when you just try to write for everybody, you come up with this bland, vanilla style. I mean, I occasionally, if I have a column that's in Australia and it's republished in America, I'll alter some of the slang expressions, but some I won't alter, because I think, well, this is actually a great expression. It'd be fun to introduce it to America, and I think that sometimes I take great. I think the differences in different forms of English are one of the great pleasures of the language.
And so, but you have to have an ear for that, which you must have.
Yes, I do, and I think it's difficult. I think someone said to me once, well, you know, I had read as some kind of exercise, had compared a column of mine as it appeared in the Chicago Sun-Times, the National Post in Canada, and the Daily Telegraph in Britain, and noticed these particular variations said, wouldn't it be just great if you could get a software program that would just automatically replace the obscure Canadian reference with an obscure American reference?
Be careful what you ask for. Because, you know, these translates the page in Google.
Yeah.
You know what happens?
Yes, I know. But I think at some point you have to have a kind of built-in. You can't.
You have to have an air.
You can't. You've got to have an. And it's not just. It's not just about words. I think it is also about the rhythm of language. And I think that is. I think it's very. It would be very difficult to fake that. It couldn't. It's not quite. It's in a strange way. Because it's subtler. It's not as easy as. Learning to speak an entirely foreign language, and I think that's why you can't. Unless you have a kind of aptitude for that, you just can't plow through it. Translate. I mentioned Kingsley Amis earlier. I don't want to kind of beat up on his son Martin Amis, but his son has always loved America, and he wrote a couple of years ago. He wrote a kind of an attempt at a kind of authentic American kind of postmodern thriller type thing. And I thought his ear for Americanism was just completely ridiculous and absurd and unconvincing. I think at some point you've got to have your own voice, but you've got to occasionally you've also got to know your audience and know when you're better off saying bloke rather than guy or whatever. That's quite important.
Andrew Roberts, the English-speaking people since 1900. Do you think he's managed to catch the sort of international resonance that will allow that to work equally in any one of the Anglosphere markets or the Anglophone markets?
Well, Andrew is a great a popular historian and a great writer, but he writes much more, I would say, in a British voice. I regard myself much more as the kind of the classic rootless cosmopolitan. You know, when both in my sinister membership of the International Zionist Conspiracy and all the other things I get accused of, but also I think in my writing style, there's lots of bits. I think there's bits about American English. Oddly enough, was the first language I fell in love with, really just from things like Warner Brothers movies and from popular songs. You'd hear odd phrases.
Yes.
And they were really the first things to start me talking about thinking about English as a language, because obviously when you're a child, English is a given, and you're learning Latin and French and all the rest of it. And so that was Warner Brothers kind of gangster talk was one of the first things that got me interested in English. But I love that side. But I also love, Evelyn Waugh and P.G. Wodehouse, and you can hear that kind of clash sometimes in columns where there'll be a lurch from the robust American vernacular into something slightly more effete and ornate. But I like that.
But before we talk about your book, I have one more question, and that is when you look at the body of your work, there are interesting things going on in your vocation, I think. And one is that you are redefining what a public intellectual is, or you're part of that process. But secondly, you're writing about movies, theater, musical, politics, war, and so on. Any comments about how you bring all that together and how it makes a difference in the way you do your work?
Well, I went a couple of months ago. I was in Australia, and I went into the ABC, which is their big national broadcaster, thinking I was going to do a show on the jihad and global politics and everything. And I got there, and the guy says, well, here's the way we're going to do it. First, I want to talk about songwriting for the first half hour, and then we'll move into the end of the world.
Right, exactly. Last things first.
And I go, oh, great, sure. So, we'll do, they don't write them like they used to for half an hour, and then it's the end, it's the apocalypse, let's head for the hills. And of course, we had to make a transition. So at some point, at 28 minutes past the half hour or whatever, we had to stop talking about beloved old songs and slide into, I think it was you know, whatever particular war and conflagration was happening that morning.
I hope you use Waltzing Matilda to make them.
Well, I would have, I would have appreciated some music there. But I made the point that in an obviously, if in an ideal world, I love writing about music, I love writing about film and theatre, and I would do that if this was an ideal world. But I think at some point, if there are great things going on in the world and you want to say something about them and you don't, it's not going to be any consolation to me to have a great CD collection as Western civilization falls apart. In a sense, you've got to, if you value the freedom to stroll into some piano bar in a hotel somewhere on the planet and hear a great singer singing The Way You Look Tonight or whatever, you've got to understand that even that little miniature experience is at the apex of a whole cultural foundation, and that you can't just sort of shear off the small pleasures of a 32-bar song from all the big geopolitical issues. They are explicitly connected in that sense.
Let me show your book now, and then let's talk about your book, America Alone, The End of the World as We Know It, and draw you out on that subject. I think one of the first points that comes across very strongly is your view of Europe and its failure to meet the challenges of our world. Talk a little about that. What's wrong with Europe?
Well, I think Europe is in a profoundly weak state. As such, it faces a perfect storm of crises that it would require huge skill to be able to line up like some kind of Rubik's Cube and figure out a way to get it all properly aligned. And I don't think the political class in Europe, which is an astonishingly complacent political class and one that is not as responsive to popular pressures as exists in the United States, I think it's much more closed in that respect. I think it's going to be very unlikely that they will muster the will to see that through. But, you know, their first problem is a basic one, which is that they have deathbed demography, which is to say that 17 European countries are basically at what they call lowest low fertility rates, which is 1.3 or below, which no society has recovered from. Now, you can look at falling fertility rates around the world. It's also happening in Japan, it's also happening in Canada, it's also happening in parts of Asia. But who gets there first to the real deathbed numbers is going to be critical, and right now the Europeans are on line to get there first. What have they done? In effect, they imported a Muslim population to be the children they couldn't be bothered having. And that in turn, I think, is transforming the political character of the continent at a very swift rate. And so I wrote the book in a sense because I think that this idea that somehow it's simply George W. Bush's Texan boorishness that affronts Europe is not really the issue here. He could speak beautiful French and be charming and sophisticated with Jacques Chirac at continental banquets at the Élysée Palace, and it would make absolutely no difference, because what we're seeing here is a profound divergence between the continent of Europe and the United States that will become a permanent feature of life. If you were Jacques Chirac, you had 40% Muslim youth unemployment rates in your cities. The last thing you need is to send your troops marching into battle alongside the great Satan. That simply is not going to be a priority for you in any rational scenario. And that's nothing to do with how swaggering Bush is or how much of a Texan gunslinger he is or any of the things that European cartoonists make fun of him for.
Now, what do you see as the root causes that come out of domestic policy that essentially, the welfare state and that route has led to an internal bankruptcy that is contributing to things like the deathbed demography?
Well, I do think you can, in a sense, simply, when life becomes too soft and amusing, I think it's very hard to reconnect with something as basic as a survival instinct. You know, in a sense, what is mysterious often to people who look at it from this side of the Atlantic is the French, for example, have much more free time than we do. They work much shorter weeks. They have a 35-hour week. They retire earlier. They have paid vacation, long paid vacations. Similarly in Germany. Germany has very generous employment provision, education provision. You know, people stay at school until well into their early mid-30s and they retire very early. And you think to yourself, well, what do they do with all this free time? You cannot look on what they on the way Europeans live and think today that they are producing great art, great music, or any of these other things. There are other features, I think, that of European life that indicate that, in a sense, they've become kind of softened into a kind of semi-comatose state. That shows not just in the demography, but in the whole lack of energy, artistic energy, entrepreneurial energy on the continent.
Mm. You talk about civilization exhaustion, and you make a distinction between primary versus secondary impulses. Let's follow up on that, because it's the way you develop this idea of where Europe has gone wrong.
Yes, I mean, I think you can reach a point where the state over-guarantees so much of life that you can maintain a population in a kind of permanent adolescence. And in a sense, we're halfway there, and Canada is, 80% of the way there. It's not just a European phenomenon. We think it entirely normal, not just the Europeans, but many people in this country think it entirely normal, for example, that the state should be responsible for our health care. While we expect to be able, if we go to the supermarket, we expect to be able to choose from a range of 100 breakfast cereals. If we're ordering a cable TV package, we expect to get 500 channels. We demand more and more choice in peripheral areas of life, but on the critical issues, we're happy to mortgage the choices to the government. And I think at a certain point, you reach the point where you can actually sever people from basic survival instincts, and certainly from the cross-generational impulse. If you think it's perfectly normal that your rather boring elderly parents should become the charges of the state because you don't want to have them living in your spare bedroom, so the state should pay for them to go off and live somewhere else, it's very easy then to figure out if you can do without grandparents, that you can also do without grandchildren. Mm-hmm. It's not such a big leap, and it certainly happened in Europe.
Mm-hmm. One might argue that changes in society, changes in the international economy are almost making these things that you're describing as inevitable, an inevitable consequence. How do you respond to that? In other words, help us understand why this isn't inevitable and what you have to do about it to make it not be inevitable.
Well, I should say up front, I should have said earlier, I certainly don't pretend to have the answer to all the questions, even on shows like this. But I think it's hard to deny that there aren't very big questions out there. Now, I look at the United States, for example. We can figure out which kinds of societies don't work. You can make arguments in Europe about which countries have high birth rates and low birth rates, but however you slice it, they're all failing to maintain stable populations. Mm-hmm. By contrast, if you look at, for example, the United States, in amongst all its particular problems that people like to point out, the 40 million with no health insurance, the massive gun crime and all the rest of it, it nevertheless, in its core statistics, is the one healthy Western nation. So you can say to yourself, if I were European, I'd say to myself, well, we can argue about whether Sweden's system is marginally less bad than Italy's, but in the end, they're all failing on the core numbers, on the key numbers. America isn't. Maybe we should learn from America. Mm-hmm.
You say at one point, social programs are a security threat because they weaken the ultimate line of defense, the freeborn citizen whose responsibilities are not subcontracted to the government.
Yes, I think that is true. I think it's very different in Europe. The response of the Spaniards, for example, to the March 11th bombings 3 years ago, you can argue about particular aspects of that, but the fact is that this is a people that fought a bloody civil war in the 1930s. Faced with an external challenge this time round, they just basically shrugged and said, okay, it's not that important to us, let's give up. I think you can see the same thing happening in Belgium and the Netherlands, a kind of ennui that sets in. It's interesting to me that 3 years ago, when I first started writing about demographic issues and positing a kind of Islamification of the continent, people said to me, European commentators said, this is nonsense, this is rubbish, it's not going to happen. Now a lot of them say, well, yes, it is going to happen, but maybe it won't be so bad. And another group of them say, okay, well, maybe it will be bad, but there's nothing we can do about it, so we just have to accept it. That fatalism, I think, is not a healthy. All successful societies have a kind of vigor, and in part, one of the problems that we deal with in the Middle East, for example, is that there again is a kind of fatalism that is built into certain aspects of Arab culture. No successful society is simply fatalistic, and a lot of continental Europe is.
Mm-hmm. The second piece of your book, which I will show again, America Alone, is the threat posed by Islam. Let's talk a little about that, because it follows naturally, because this Europe that you've just described is incapable of addressing the problem, and in fact has become codependent, or rather dependent on the Islamic world to, as you said, to bring in, so that Europe can bring in people to have the workers to fund the social security system for the aging Europeans. Yeah. So what is particularly the main aspect of the threat of the Islam?
Well, there's really two parts to that. There's obviously, and one should say straight out, there's obviously millions and millions of Muslims around the world who just want to live their lives, get on with their lives. But what we're seeing is not just an increase in Muslim population around the world, a very dramatic increase. It holds a much bigger share of the population now than it did in the 1970s. But we're seeing also a radicalization of those Muslim populations, and a conscious radicalization of those populations from Saudi Arabia, Iran, and other forces. Now, it hasn't radicalized 100% of them. It hasn't radicalized 50% of them. But what percentage of them does it have to radicalize for it to place a profound question mark over the future of societies with significant Muslim populations? You know, we often talk about how there's not a lot of freedom in the Muslim world. It's also the case there's not a lot of freedom once a Muslim population gets to about 20%. If you look at the sort of statistics on this, if a Muslim population is somewhere between 20 and 50%, it's harder to operate what we in America would regard as a classically liberal society. I think there were three exceptions to that: Serbia and Montenegro, Benin and Suriname in the former Dutch colony. And so those are not, and I don't think those would be regarded as successful models by the United States. So what does it mean, for example, to the Netherlands when they face that situation really within the next generation? Are they going to be a fourth exception to that rule, a state with a 20% Muslim population that is still relatively free, or will they already be reaching accommodations to find ways of not offending those Muslim populations? When you look at this itsy-bitsy news items, 2 schools in Berlin have introduced separate entranceways now for Muslim students and non-Muslim students. You're already seeing signs that the European response to this will be forms of segregation, in forms of restrictions on the speech of everybody in order to accommodate certain minorities. That is not going to be a successful way to go.
People in the audience might say you're walking a fine line here, that what you're saying sounds racist. But I want to draw your argument out to make the point that isn't the case. And what I want to address is something you say. You say global jihad lurks within Islam, and Islam is a political project. And the example that you were just giving was suggesting that there is in Islamic culture a lack of division between what we consider to be secular and what is considered to be religious, which goes back to this whole problem of the separation of the state from religion.
That's right.
that Islam never mastered. And I gather that's the point that you're trying to make, that there is an insinuation in Western society where what we call multiculturalism opens us up to not dealing well with this contradiction.
No, I think Islam differs from Christianity, say, in that it is an explicitly political project, and indeed an explicitly imperial project too, that I think Muslims are enjoined, in effect, to eventually bring the entire world within the house of Islam by conquest. That was the way Muhammad saw it. He was a great warrior. He didn't do the Jesus thing. Jesus' final words to his disciples before he ascended into heaven were, it told them to go to all the cities in the known world and persuade people. So you look at how Christianity developed. It percolated up from the lowest members of society, eventually up to the top. If you look at the way Islam advanced, it advanced mainly by conquest. I think that difference is built into Islam. And I don't regard it as a racist issue, in part because I think Islam has a lot of appeal to pasty white folks. If you look at recent news stories, you can see that we're seeing more and more white converts to Islam who are being attracted to some of these jihadist elements. This plot last summer to seize these various airliners at Heathrow and blow them up en route to America or over America. One of the fellows involved in that, his name was, he changed his name to Mohammed bin Jihad or whatever, but he was actually the son of a Conservative Party agent called, he had a name like, you know, Nigel Fotheringay Phipps or something, straight out of P.G. Woodhouse. Exactly. And he was like Bertie Wooster the jihadist. And so this, I don't think it is a racial issue. I think this is, in a sense, an ideology that has great appeal, whatever particular race you happen to belong to. And I think that is I think we have a difficulty understanding that aspect of it, because when a mosque opens on Main Street, we don't, in our mind, we don't distinguish between that and a new congregational church opening or a new Episcopal church. And we see it as a house of God, and that is all it is. But it is not all it is. And also in our particular, as you mentioned, multiculturalism, I think in a multicultural society, in a sense, we have great difficulty, I think, coping with the idea of a kind of unicultural society. And Islam is really the perfect unicultural society in which both your faith and your political system are bound up in this one perfect system. And a multicultural society that wants to just put Islam as one of those things on the smorgasbord with Episcopalianism and baptism and Catholicism and Judaism and Buddhism and New Age and Wiccans and all the rest, it's not. It's something more than that.
And Kay, who tackled you on a book notes program a little while ago, what would you give your final answer? What's your final answer to Kay, wherever she was?
Who is Kay now?
Well, she was a lady caller on a show I was on, and she had that thing which I find slightly unnerving, which is that kind of faintly sort of New Age passivity that people have. I don't mind. I quite like the kind of conspiracists who say, oh, you know, Bush pulled off 9/11, it was an inside job and all that, because at least they're kind of engaged. Kay belongs to a group that I regard as really much more worrying, is the people who sort of exist in a fluffy cloud of multicultural complacency. If they cite any historical precedents to you, it's always Martin Luther King and Gandhi. And I think it's very easy to adopt that strategy if you're dealing with racist American rednecks or British imperial administrators. I don't believe either of their strategies would have worked if you were up against the guys who killed all those kids in that schoolhouse in Chechnya, or the fellows who blew up the nightclub in Bali. And I think this idea that the sort of give peace a chance thing is not going to work here. I mean, these are people who are, I quoted to Kay, thinking it would get a rise out of her, poor lady, the words of a British Muslim speaking at Trinity College, Dublin. Somebody in the audience said, "What is Muhammad's message to unbelievers?" And he said, "Muhammad's message to unbelievers is, I am here to slaughter you all." And I quoted, I quoted this line to Kay, and she goes, "Well, that only means we have to redouble our efforts to work even harder." Now, what she means by redouble our efforts to work even harder is she basically means she's not making any effort, she's not going to redouble anything, she just doesn't want to think about it. She doesn't want to have to think about it. And I think the idea that it makes no difference to a society, if you happen to live in a town and it's 80% Congregationalist, I'm not citing them as I'm no fan of the Congregationalist church at all, really. But let's say that for a start. 80% Congregationalist and 20% Muslim, or it's 80% Muslim and 20% Congregationalist. Those are two very different societies.
Mm-hmm. You make a point of emphasizing the Saudi role in bringing out some of the worst aspects of Islam and pushing this Wahhabi strain, which we were talking about earlier. Let's play that out a little. In other words, how do you see them, what is their nefarious role in all of this in making the possibilities of Islam go in a direction that really leads to terrorism?
Well, I think Saudi Arabia is the great foreign policy mistake of the 20th century. It's a state that should never have been created and never entrusted to that family. And Ibn Saud, God bless him, very successfully played off the British and the Americans against each other in that. I think the whole of the modern Middle East, which was invented by the British and French in 1922, is a disaster. In fact, but even on the scale of that disaster, the creation of Saudi Arabia is far worse. It speaks, I think, to one of the more problematic aspects of the United States, which is that America is a non-imperial superpower. So in a sense, it's always preferred to do business through clients. And in this case, it created these clients in the Middle East, and they turned into a monster. Now, when the president says, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, the short answer to that is that Saudi Arabia has checked the both of the above box. Occasionally, they're more, the princes they put up on CNN give the impression that they're with us. But they're also funding, they're the main ideological funders of our enemies around the world. And it's not just that they're both with us and with the terrorists, but that every time somebody goes and gasses up and fills their car up, they too are funding both sides of this war. Because Saudi Arabia's principal export is not oil, but ideology. And all the oil does is enable them to fund the ideology.
Is the prescription then to declientize them, to pull the rug out from underneath the Saudi royal family? What do we do? I think
I'm not one of these people who thinks that if you get rid of the House of Saud, whatever follows will be worse. I think that there would be a lot of benefits to basically, you know, in a sense, the jihad at one level is a Saudi problem that the Saudis successfully exported to the rest of the world. It would be a very good thing to repatriate the problem and say that if they want to duke this thing out, they would be better to do it in the Arabian Peninsula rather than in Indonesia and Central Asia and Europe and North America and all the other parts of the planet they've destabilized.
Obama, go home.
You say, so you make an intriguing point, an important point in discussing Islam. You say the moderation of Islam comes from the surrounding culture, meaning the places where Islam has gone and been shaped and adapted by culture. Talk a little about that, because that's an important point. And you see Europe unable to do that,
yes.
But clearly we in the United States are able to some extent, do it successfully.
I think I'm not, you know, I'm not complacent about it at all. But I do think that the United States does a much better job of assimilating Muslims than the Europeans do. There is an American dream, and Muslims can tap into that. If there is a Belgian dream or a French dream, Muslims are by and large excluded from it. I mean, it's horrible, these dehumanizing estates that they keep Muslims in France. It's a shocking and disgraceful thing. And that's why, in effect, they're becoming more radicalized with each generation. So when you look back and you think, well, what are the kind of societies in which Islam exists in a kind of more or less benign tension with the broader society? They're not very encouraging examples. Central Asia under the Soviets, those Muslims in that part of the world, in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, they were moderate imbibers of alcohol, not on the same industrial level as the average Slav was to the north, but they certainly were moderate, as I said, moderate drinkers, and Islam was not a problem under the Soviets. Within months, in effect, of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Saudis and the Iranians had spent all this walking around money up there and successfully radicalized them. One exception, Turkmenistan, where the crazy dictator, Turkmenbashi, effectively wrote his own Quran, this absurd book which is like some Deepak Chopra rewrite of the Quran, and demanded it be placed in every mosque. And when the head imam objected to it, he basically fired him and tossed him in jail. And this guy, again, it's the one Stan where there aren't guys jumping up and down in the street shouting death to the great Satan. Similarly, Indonesia under the dictatorship. Now, of course, if you say this to Americans, these are not encouraging examples. You know, if that's what it takes to moderate Islam, nobody here wants to become the Soviet Union or Turkmenbashi or the Indonesian dictatorship. Even when you look at British India, which held Islam in its Muslim minority there in a kind of controlled state, even that is not an encouraging example to the Americans. But it does show, I think, that Islam, in a sense, is as opportunist as the broader society allows. And the problem in Europe is that the modern multicultural state of continental Europe is a nullity. Even if you wanted to assimilate with it, how could you? What does it mean to be British in the year 2007? The fellows who blew up the London Tube were British born and bred. They'd been raised in British schools, they liked fish and chips, they liked cricket, they liked lousy English pop music and leisure wear, and in the end they got on those tubes and blew up their fellow British subjects. Simply put, there is in those societies that promote this kind of weak, weedy, lowest common denominator multiculturalism, there's nothing to assimilate to.
So why do you believe that America is uniquely qualified alone to address these problems?
Well, I think America, in some ways, and one, you know, obviously, in a sense, this is a 50-50 nation, and at any one time, half the country will disagree on some of these things. But America is the last state in the Western world, with the possible exception of Australia, where qualities like self-reliance are still valued, where the birth rate is still healthy, and where it is still not the accepted role of life that the primal responsibilities of adulthood should be exercised by the government. You know, that is true. When I bought my house in New Hampshire, I was a kind of urban guy. I wasn't too used to living in the country, and that first night I heard something which was, you know, probably just some kind of animal wandering around the door, and I got a little nervous, and I called my police chief and said, well, what should I do with it? If it's an intruder, what should I do? And the police chief went, well, you know, you need to disable him yourself, because if you call me, I'll be asleep. And by the time I get there, I'll be dragging you out. I'd much rather drag him out. And that is simply not something you would ever hear, for example, in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, if you hear somebody, my poor old sister-in-law lives in a bucolic part of the English countryside. She hears somebody prowling around the perimeter. She calls 999, which is their 911, and it comes through to some answering machine off the coast of Scotland somewhere, and they get back to her 2 weeks later. I mean, it's simply put, this is, I think, the last, even in a vulnerable state, this is the last country where people, where what we would regard as traditional impulses of adulthood are still wielded by a significant proportion of the population.
It seems to me that in your book, you see resolve in confronting these threats as very important, but on the other hand, you are also open to an array of vehicles for dealing with the threat. Is that fair?
Yes, I do think resolve is what matters, because I think nobody is scared of America's nuclear arsenal. They're scared about the possibility of America using it. You can have all the tanks and all the ships and all the guns in the world, and if nobody thinks they ever have to fear you using them, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference at all. And in fact, that is the calculation that America's enemies have made through, on the basis of things like Mogadishu 10 years ago. They basically concluded that the vast arsenal counts for as nothing measured against a few dozen body bags on TV. That in a sense America is like a late period Ottoman sultan lying on his cushions, and if you prick him in his toes, he'll howl up in pain. He's not a genuine superpower. That's the calculation that the jihad has made, and that Ahmadinejad makes, and that Kim Jong-il makes, and that a lot of others make. And America, at some level, has to show that that is a false view of the United States.
Mm-hmm. But you also suggest in your book that emphasizing women's rights in the Islamic world, that there are various vulnerabilities that one has to play to succeed.
I'm in favor of creative destabilization. I think it's disgraceful that this country spends a fortune on intelligence operations and gets nothing from the CIA. The CIA sits around in Langley, Virginia, and reads emails from outer space all day. That's what they do, and it's outrageous. And there are a lot of things that we could be doing that would ensure that those guys had a few of the headaches that we do, and that a lot of European prime ministers have right at this moment. And the women's rights issue, I think, is absolutely the critical wedge into that world. Because it's true, a lot of women, I mean, you look at the appeal of Islam on the continent, where it's a lot of women who convert to Islam. It's clear that there is a substantive chunk of modern Western women who don't regard Britney Spears as the be-all and end-all, don't want to go around with navel piercings, find the sort of slatternliness of that all very. But that doesn't mean, on the other hand, that they want to live in a world that starts with genital mutilation and ends with honor killing. There is a vast potential for subversion by bringing women's rights to the forefront of American policy, which doesn't mean sending Karen Hughes to traipse around the Arab world in a designer burqa. You know, that is completely ridiculous. But it should not be beyond the wit of this country, for the amount of money it spends on intelligence, to figure out how to use that as a wedge into the Muslim world.
Are we
Mark,
going to end?
I'm afraid our time
All right.
is out.
Okay.
Tom, we've just about. Mark, I want to thank you very much for coming to be the Nimitz lecturer and appearing on our program. And I will show your book one more time, America Alone. And thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank
Here.
you. I've been a little ill at ease with the Berkeley dress code. This is the first, your show is the first thing I've done here. I haven't worn a tie for, and now you're wearing one.
Well, we've got to fool the audience.
Yeah.
That's
Exactly.
right.
Keep
And
guessing.
Tom, thank you very
Thank
much
you
for
very much,
joining
Harry.
us. And
Delighted.
thank you,
Mark.
very much for joining us for this conversation with history.